Appreciate you listening to Disciples View. I'm Todd Herman. We'll get to the tire babbling and a personal note and a few other things to wrap up. First of all, it's my pleasure to welcome to the program M.D. Perkins. He's director and producer of Culture Warrior, great movie talking about the history of Don Wildmon, the original Culture Warrior. MD's done a lot more than that. MD, great to have you back on the program. Thank you.
Yes, great to be with you again, Todd.
If you were to take this election that President Trump just won, and you were to take the temperature of the culture war, in what areas do you think we're legitimately gaining ground beyond, say, the theatrics involved in executive orders? Because they're great, but you still have separate countries like Washington State that just has now made a move this week to enshrine the chemical and surgical mutilation of kids into their constitution at the same time as enshrining abortion. So there's been some great progress in terms of bringing attention to this. Some states have changed rules. But where do you think President Trump is at in terms of winning a culture war in this country?
Well, I think there's several things. I mean, we definitely have seen a culture shift in terms of the climate and the interest. We're seeing companies pulling back not only their DEI programs, but also, kind of distancing themselves from pride groups and things like that. I mean, that was a shocking thing when AFA quit their boycott over Target. Part of the stated reason for that was to see that not only did Target, make some changes overall, but one of those changes was that they changed the way that they were speaking about the Human Rights Campaign, which is, if you don't know, is one of the largest pro-gay, pro-LGBT lobbying groups in the nation, and has been very influential behind the scenes in terms of corporate boardrooms, corporate policy, and things like that. And I think, the fact that Donald Trump won the election is evidence that people were tired of a lot of what they've been fed from the mainstream media and entertainment avenues and things like that. So, I mean, of course, a Donald Trump presidency doesn't solve everything. An executive order doesn't solve everything. But I think in terms of getting some of these legislations passed and things enacted, now is the time to do it when there's a lot of momentum on our side as opposed to a lot of momentum on the left.
Yeah, well said. And there's a great difference between being so-called anti-gay and wanting to have a view, which is the biblical view of marriage, cherished and held to. Yeah. And we are told very, very much and consistently we're to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we don't want ourselves given bad spiritual advice. We want ourselves to land in heaven. So it is an act of love to very lovingly talk to people who are same-sex attracted. You mentioned the Human Rights Campaign. They're the nadir. Yes. Just very opposite of what Brother Don did in the culture war. They're a shakedown group. They're a group that worked behind the scenes to see that kids were trans surgically and chemically.
Sure.
So praise God that they're losing. What do you think Brother Don would look at today, who is the original culture warrior? Where do you think he would be celebrating these victories right now? And what work do you think he'd see left to be done?
That's a question I've wondered a lot in recent weeks as we've watched so many different positive things, in my view, unfold nationally. I think he would certainly praise some of the forward efforts of addressing trans sports issues and chemical castration regarding transgender ideology and pulling back on the DEI and things like that. I think there's so many facets to this. And you mentioned loving our neighbor. That comes to mind because I think people have this wrong view of the culture war, as if we're just in constant opposition to people and we're hateful and we're bigoted and we don't want to listen to other people's opinions, when really the whole point of the culture war is it is an attempt to love our neighbor. It's an attempt to recognize common grace realities that if this is harmful for an individual, then this is something that's harmful for everybody. And out of love for our neighbor and love for the nation, love for people, then we need to stand up and speak out about it. And so that's what Don was doing when it related to pornography, when it related to the homosexual agenda, when it related to anti-Christian bias in media and entertainment. And, the list goes on in terms of his culture war fight. So, so many of those same battles we see in the documentary Culture Warrior are things that are still battles that we're fighting today, even though some of the technology has changed and some of the ways that we might approach that have changed. But the battles themselves regarding decency and morality and common sense approaches to a lot of these issues are still relevant.
Yeah, well said. And Culture Warrior, the movie is out. It's something you can go see, and we encourage you to go see it. The website is culturewarrior.movie, and it tells the story of how Brother Don was the first culture warrior, how he started a movement that was first laughed at, and I want to get into that with you because I love that part of the story, MD. First laughed at, oh, who's this hillbilly from Mississippi? We don't need to worry about him. The laughter didn't last long.
Yeah.
As I want to talk about. I do want to stress, because it's so on my heart, that when we say phrases like warrior, let us remember the way Jesus waged war. And with great love for people who were sexually fallen, with great love and compassion, and go and sin no more, right? Because that's part of the truth telling that we need to be able to do. And you mentioned, some of the victories. I just had this conversation briefly with a woman named Megan Mersley. Okay. She's a political writer. You know who she is?
I don't know her, no.
Okay, so she's a White House reporter for Politico, and she wrote on Twitter, for decades, the Republican Party has championed a culture war under President Donald Trump. That war is taking a sharp turn towards a secular, weird view. And I asked her, did Republicans start the culture war by pretending boys are girls? Did they start it by teaching 6th and 7th graders how to perform sex acts? Did they start it by explaining that a person's melanin levels determine their degree of racism or virtue? Do you think Brother Don started the culture war?
Well, I mean, in the sense of standing up and speaking out against something, I think there's an element of, but he was responding to something that was already latent within American society. When he sat down to watch TV and he's inundated with images of sex and violence and profanity, and he recognizes, I've just been sitting back and taking these things in, and how are these things impacting my children, people in my church congregation, society as a whole? And so he began to study the impact of television as a mass medium on American society, and began to realize that these things are detrimental, and nobody is really speaking up about it, because even at the time, so many of the reports that had been done had been funded by television networks to basically hold up their view that nothing, that you can view as much violence and it doesn't really impact you substantially at all. And so when Don was starting to combat these things, he realized that there were already things that had deep roots in American society, but he thought, maybe if I can speak out and get enough people interested and willing to think about this, then maybe we could begin to make an impact. And then to realize just how, when you respond in that way, and this is the same thing we're seeing now, when you respond to the darkness that's out there, the darkness does push back, and it is not sanitized, it is not safe, it is not going to act according to the rules of decorum or good, it is very happy to lie in order to gain its advantage over you. And so this is what Don saw at the time. And I think we're seeing those same elements at work today, that when you speak up about trans issues, suddenly the left really cares about it, and none of the Democrats vote against this, and all of these kinds of things kind of are intertwined together. So when you stand up and speak out, the backside is, yes, it does kind of heighten the fight, at least at that particular flashpoint sometimes, and lead to other battles that you didn't immediately see right on the horizon.
MD Perkins is with us, director and producer of Culture War. He's done much more than that. Just brief bio. There's so much more to his life. But MD, I am a guy who had this weird opportunity. In this way, this relates to Brother Don, and I want to hear your comparison. This is back in the day when I first started talk radio, before I did tech and all that. Yeah. I announced my show to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and I was an arrogant little jerk. And he came to speak in Spokane, and I raised my hand, and he called on me, and I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for taking the question. My name is Todd Herman, and on Monday I'm starting a program called Back Talk with Todd Herman, AM 1230 KSBN AM at 9 a.m., and I intend to use a good portion of that show to see that you are not reelected because you become fantastically wealthy cheating this district." And Speaker Foley laughed.
Yeah.
And said, "Well, son, a lot of bigger people than you have tried, and they've failed. I wish you luck." I said, "The name is not Son, it's Todd Herman, Mr. Speaker, and I think you're going to remember that." And there was a poll later that showed that my little show that ended up on the nightly news, that ended up with Ted Koppel talking about it, that was in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Wall Street Journal, Nippon News in Japan, it led to his loss. And again, I was an arrogant little jerk, but I saw in his eyes when he lost, this astonishment. And I actually made a phone call to him after the loss to impress upon him this was not a personal thing. He didn't buy that. But he did remember my name. And again, I was arrogant. Don was not. Yeah. But when Don took this on, didn't he have a very similar response from these big companies going, who are you, hillbilly?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these people think that they're invincible, and they think their institutions are invincible and above any kind of scrutiny or analysis or anything like that. So then when anybody brings up any question, your credentials are questioned, your status in life is questioned, where you came from is questioned. I mean, you can't win for losing with anybody on this, so like you can't make a report that will be sufficient for them to recognize it and want to bring it in as part of the discussion if they control the terms of the discussion. So, like, that's what Don recognized, and he had enough thick skin to not be fully bothered by that and to just press through it and recognize. I mean, Don would say, yes, they will mistreat me, they will misrepresent me in media, and they will mischaracterize what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to do, but I trust that the average person, when they read this, will be able to read through the lies and understand what I'm bringing up has some merit to it. And if it doesn't have merit to it, then no one will end up supporting me, and I'll shut down tomorrow. That's fine. I'll go do something else. But if this does have merit to it and God's blessing is behind it, then I will trust that I can continue to speak up and that people will continue to join me in this effort.
You can watch this unfold in a great movie called Culture Warrior. You can go see it, watch it today. It's at culturewarrior.movie, and this tells the story about the original pushback. Because I think we can give Brother Don credit for being the first to allow God to work through him to push back against these things. When do you think, MD? I mean, I told my Tom Foley's story. I think he figured it out that this was a real problem when he sent a chief of staff to my show because he wouldn't come on, and someone had furnished me this audio tape of Speaker Foley speaking at the Gridiron Dinner, which is where the politicians and media get together and they glad hand. Yeah. And Speaker Foley said the stupidest thing. On stage, he said, people ask me if my $173,000 a year salary is commensurate with the people of the 5th District of Washington State I represent. And I tell them it is, unless you take into account the Whitey lunch buckets and Johnny Do-Nothings that make up 80% of the district. Okay. And, the laughter of the D.C. elite. Yeah. And when they sent that chief of staff onto my program, I let him speak for 10 minutes, and then I played that piece of audio for him. And we had international and national media in there. And his response to me was, where'd you get that? Mm-hmm. And then it was, you're not supposed to have that. Right. And beyond that, he, in fact, said nothing. Not only that, but in front of all these cameras, he walked out of the room. Yeah. I think at that point, they realized, this goofy kid, this community college dropout, he's hurting us. Yeah. When did they figure out that God was using Brother Don, and what was the first instance where these big elite untouchables sat back and said, oh, no, what's happening?
Yeah, I think you can date it pretty directly to the early 1980s. Don started the ministry in 1977, the National Federation for Decency. And, at first it was just kind of a curiosity story. Who is this little country bumpkin preacher trying to do these things against television? Who does he think he is? How's he going to gain any momentum? And then after a couple of campaigns against Campbell Soup and Sears as being advertisers on Three's Company and other raunchy programs, and he was able to win the day with those corporations where they actually removed support on those programs, suddenly the networks changed their tune a little bit, and then the way that the media began to cover Don changed. Suddenly he wasn't just this country bumpkin preacher, but now he was a censor. Now he had this, but at the same time, they still had to say that he doesn't have any power or control. It's still just this really tiny group of people. It doesn't even make sense the way that they describe these things. Yes. In kind of the same situation you're describing. But that's how they would always play it. It doesn't even make sense, but that's how they would try and get this thing across, to try and convince people, don't listen to him. And by the way, nobody listens to him. And by the way, he's really dangerous.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I had the same kind of response in Spokane when this thing unfolded between me and Speaker Foley. And the media that wouldn't talk about my show because no one listened to it, all of a sudden we're writing editorials about my show because too many people listened to it.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget when the guy who was the editorial lead of the Spokesman Review in Spokane called me and said, would you ever consider allowing me to interview you for a profile? Yeah, let's do it now.
Yeah.
And he did this. I think his name was Chris Peck, if I'm not mistaken. And he told me, you should know this probably isn't going to be very friendly. I said, I'm looking forward to the attack because it's going to help me. Mm-hmm. They didn't understand that they'd lost all this credibility.
Yeah.
And with Don and what he did, he didn't bring the credibility of an arrogant kid who God had gifted with smarts, and I didn't get that yet. But Don also brought with him the word of God that never returns void. Did they get that? Did they ever understand that they weren't really battling Don Wildmon, but they were battling God?
Well, I think they did. That's part of why their opposition was so hostile, honestly. Like, this is a spiritual war. When we talk about the culture war, it is more than just battles between opposing ideologies. It is a spiritual war for the hearts and minds of people in the world.
So well said. Please go watch the movie, Culture Warrior Movie. I'd love to have you back again, MD. You're always so good on the program. And thank God for you and the movie. We'll come back on the Disciples' View. I'm Todd Herman.